Okay, thank you everyone for joining the Ask Me Anything PCI edition, number two actually, with Justin Leapline. Very excited about this one. Wanted to just let you know about a few things and actually a couple of items ahead of time that this is being recorded. So definitely make sure that if you have any other questions or it doesn't get back to you, or you would like to review it, uh, uh, certainly go back and do that. And then I just really wanted to kind of touch on, typically I go over a little bit about TrustedSec and the types of things that we're doing, but really wanted to touch on maybe a few services this time that are new and really getting a lot of attention. So I'll start with that first one. And we obviously are a full service consulting organization, but we've added some different practices. And really, as the security has gotten much more expansive, much more complex, we continue to push the envelope and actually get a lot of requests from our clients as well. So the first, and I'll go over three of them just real quickly. The first one that we're getting a lot of interest in is ransomware resilience. And in that one, it's pretty much, sounds, it is what it sounds like, that we'll test and look at all different aspects of your organization, starting with the business needs and requirements, from data classification, your insurance even, how you're doing crisis communications, to network and security policy and architecture review, identity access management, privileged accounts, incident response, threat management, things like that. And then we'll actually, in external law enforcement, and then we'll go into a couple of services also that we can look at even more in depth, getting deep down into the services from a defensive backup review, and then validate those defenses with using as adversary simulations that typical threat actors will use when they're using ransomware against you. The second one is assumed breach. So as the name suggests, we are assuming that you've been breached, and we'll take a unique approach in emulating tactics, techniques, and procedures employed by the various groups of threat actors. So we'll really simulate a post-compromise activity and the types of lateral movement that you typically would see during that specific threat event. And then lastly, really what's getting, again, another ton of popularity, particularly over the last year, and especially as we see from a lot of our pen tests that continually run into these issues, which is a baseline configuration review. So we do these for Office 365, Azure, Google Cloud, AWS, and Exchange 2019, for example. So lots going on there as well. And really even seeing just those basics continue to be critical for organizations to get through. So with that, again, want to turn it over to our star of the show, Justin Leapline. And this can be actually anything, ask me anything. I think Justin would probably be able to handle it, but certainly PCI is the focus. But if you'd like to get into blockchain or cloud container, which is one of my favorite webinars that he's done, or just standards in general, definitely feel free to ask those questions. So with that, Justin, give us a quick background on yourself and what you've done, where you're from, and all the things that you've been accomplished.
And Steve, just I'm not a cat. Just FYI, I just want to let you know I'm not a cat. So.
I'm not a cat.
Yeah, so Justin Leapline. I've been around security, I think, full time since about 2005. I think I entered into full-time security from the industry. But even before that, I've been in software development, lead integrator into a number of different systems. Since that, kind of diving into the consulting world, I've led organizations, Fortune 500 from a GRC risk perspective. Also to my last role, I was head of the organizational security for a small company, 100-person-ish company, dealing in kind of fintech with that. So have broad range, especially at the regulatory compliance realm, and dealing with a lot of different, as Steve said, kind of random things out there. I've done a number of presentations on blockchain and the security implications of that. Also big into the cloud and the various deployment methodologies into that. So kind of jack of all trades, master at nothing type of thing. But Today we'll dive into the questions. If you guys want to talk about PCI, I can definitely field those. Other ones, I'll definitely tackle those as well.
So yeah, so you can either ask them in the Q&A section or in the chat section. So either one will work. Feel free to shoot those along. And so while we're waiting for a few to get going, let's start off with the first big one. What's going on with PCI 4.0? What are the big changes? Where are we with it? The timeline, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so if you haven't seen our webinar already, we actually did a review, what was that, Steve, at the end of last year, towards the end of last year, where we kind of broke down a lot of the initial 4.0 changes that came out. So definitely recommend to dive into that. We actually do screenshots directly from some of the PCI presentation with that. So that's definitely good content. Since that point, they've went through another request for comment period, which is period number 2. They're going to have one final one here coming up in April, May timeframe, I think it is. And that will be the final one before they release PCI 4.0 to the public and everything. Keep in mind, once they release it, there'll be a transition period. Typically in the past, they've given 6 months to kind of wean off the old version to then it's mandatory to submit on the new version. So that'll allow plenty of people to, if you are in the middle of 3.2.1 or, still want to do that because there's a lot of changes in 4.0, you're welcome to do that probably towards the end of the year. It will actually be determined of when they actually release it is when that sunset date will be. But typically, like I said, historically, it's been about 6 months. And then any of the new controls that they introduce, and there will be a lot, that they'll also forward date those. So if anybody's familiar with kind of the 3.1.3.2 version where they said, okay, no longer SSL early TLS was allowed, they had a best practice but not required period that you could actually not necessarily comply with some of those controls. So they'll have a future dated with that and everything. So that's kind of the where 4.0 is from a release. From a what's changing in 4.0, the biggest change from it, and there's a lot of changes into it, it's probably the most significant change since 1.0 when they merge all the standards together. They're getting rid of compensating controls at the end and implementing what's called a customized approach. Essentially what they're allowing to do is that they're allowing you to look at the control objective and say, okay, I have a tool that does this, but it doesn't meet exact letter of what they call the defined approach, which is basically their write-up of what the control should actually do. So this allows you the flexibility without any presets like the compensating controls. You actually had a serious gap, financial limitation, or something that prevented you from implementing the requirement. They basically give you a free-for-all. So you can actually implement whatever you want into that as long as it meets the intent. And this, I think, will provide a lot of flexibility to merchants and service providers. For a lot of the technology that's out there, like in the cloud or EDR solutions or something like that, standards in general just can't keep up with the new technology and deployments of that nature. So this allows you to say, yes, I'm getting a tool. Yes, I'm, hitting the objective of what the control is actually trying to do. And here's how I'm doing it. Now, the onus will be on either on the merchant service provider or the QSA to also write up a corresponding test procedure for that. So with this, implement a brand new solution that does this, but now you have to write up your own test procedure to say, okay, here's how I'm testing the effectiveness of this control to prevent against whatever the objective was for this. And with that, you'll have to write it up, and then your QSA will actually test you against that write-up with that there. Beyond that, that's kind of the context of it. There are a number of other requirements that are coming down the pipe. I think the last time we talked, they are eliminating, you're allowed to send cardholder data unencrypted across a trusted network. That's no longer the case. Anytime cardholder data is going to be transmitted, it has to be encrypted. They're implementing password flexibility, basing it off of 863B. If anybody's familiar with that, a couple of years ago, NIST came out and basically adjusted their password recommendations. Multi-factor access that they're implementing if you access cardholder data. They're implementing some stuff along the lines of data discovery, where you have to monitor for cardholder data being sent outside. That they're implementing phishing and social engineering training and prevention that you have to do with that. There's some additional cloud-related controls that they're incorporating into it. With the latest revision with RFC2, they're doing some stuff. A lot of it was rewording and doing some stuff. They reverted a couple of minor things, like some of the language around one primary function for PCI for servers. One of the biggest changes, I'm actually eager to see how it comes out in the next revision. They actually took out in requirement 5 for anti-malware, they took out the commonly affected and just said affected by malware, which could, by interpretation, open it up to basically any system, for the most part, other than maybe appliances. But I'm a little bit concerned of the impact of that on especially like cloud infrastructure and stuff of that nature. Like, is your Docker instance now required to have anti-malware on it, even though there's nobody logging into that, or, no user data interaction with it? So those are the things that I think it would be far impacting. Hopefully they'll come out with some rewording or clarification onto that. And keep in mind, I forgot to preface this. This is all in works. Everything I'm saying today could change, type of thing. This is just kind of a information of what could be coming down the pipe. A lot of it probably is coming down the pipe, but wait for the final version before doing any knee-jerk reaction to a lot of this stuff.
You said something that I just want to touch on. You said the QSA will test you on this.
Yes.
What are they looking for validation? Are they looking over your shoulder? What specifically are they doing to test you?
Yeah, so it depends on what that test procedure actually writes up. I mean, it's for the entire ROC, with that. So depending on what the control is, they could intermix observations, they could intermix looking at documentation, configurations, testing of it. They could also use other artifacts into validation, like the penetration test and things of that nature, to kind of strengthen that the control is effective. So there are a number of things right now with the ROC. They outline, you need to, what document does this? Who did you talk to? What was your observation? Explain the control environment. So they're pretty specific on, when a QSA goes through, making sure each one of those are kind of hit so that you have a good effective test of that control there, type of thing. So with that test procedure, if you're customizing what the control is, you're basically writing up what that test procedure looks like to look at the effectiveness of that control. And that could be a combination of stuff, of what I just mentioned.
Okay, great. Are there still large-scale breaches? Is there anything in common now that so many controls, chip use, tokenization, et cetera, are in use? I mean, I guess from that, do we see as many huge breaches of cardholder data anymore?
I mean, they're few and far between. Now, I think PCI has been kind of hit over the head a lot of part, at least with the effective cardholder data, but there's still breaches all the time, with that. And I think part of the fact, and it's maybe a little psychology into it, that people are getting more accustomed to hearing of breaches and everything. Like the last, I would say, really big one that affected a lot of consumers would be like the Target breach. Most people knew somebody that was affected by it. They got their card replaced into that effect. There still could be the potential for that. But what a lot of the card brands and point of sale manufacturers and things of that nature, they've really worked hard to kind of make them a pretty closed box and getting away from more of the smart registers and basically containing the registers to interact with the point of sale device as kind of a closed unit, where the register, a lot of times when we're going into customer sites, the register is largely out of scope. All they can do is send API calls to the the swipe terminal to encrypt and then send it off to the payment processor. And we see a lot more customers doing that kind of minimized approach. There are still some customers that handle cardholder data for various reasons, but a lot of the times, if you don't need that data, a lot of people are shying away from that type of thing. So I say it's still potential out there. As you know, Steve, we work with a lot of customers on varying security maturity levels, so there's definitely a possibility with that. But I think for the most part, PCI has been around for, since its adoption in 2004 is when DSS first came out. There's been a lot more enforcement, a lot more education and training, just a lot more awareness. So I think it's raised the bar to that, but it's still potential for, large breaches. So
yeah, certainly we're seeing an explosion of breaches, but just not so much in cardholder data.
Yeah. Yep.
So which is interesting. So going back to 4.0, what are there any plans for red team or purple team or more advanced techniques being used, or things like threat hunting? Is that, I don't know that it would be prescribed exactly, but would that be something that would be not a defined control, but something that you could do or show that you're doing certain things to increase your security?
Yeah, so there are things they're incorporating social engineering testing into that, not necessarily in the pen testing. It could be a separate engagement, but that will be a requirement into it with the phishing tests and everything. Beyond that, they haven't added a ton into requirement 11, where you find vulnerability scanning and penetration testing. There are some clarifications here and there and things of that nature, but not a ton type of thing. And quite honestly, I mean, they had in 11.3, they had about, a little less than a dozen bullet points into that, where it's, pretty clear that it includes application and network, it includes these types of systems, it includes, you have to have a defined methodology with that. So they were pretty, detailed on saying, okay, here's what we expect the penetration test. And they've released guidance out on the PCI Council website to even strengthen some of that, of what they consider actually a good pen test for an organization and everything. But from a expanding what they're doing, type of thing, there wasn't a ton into that. More of it was on controls, process. They have extended a bunch on risk. So if anybody's familiar on how 321 actually does risk today, there's basically, 3 bullet points into it that you have to do on an annual basis. It has to test threats and vulnerabilities that are active, and it has to end in a formal exercise with that. Now they're breaking it down that, okay, it has to be a little bit more. You have to do, something that's actually more than just those little 3 bullet points, type of thing. A lot of people are looking at, a formal exercise and just doing a 1-page write-up type of thing. So they've added a number of different, here's what we expect out of it, to kind of focus on doing better risk assessments with that. They've also added a lot more kind of references all through PCI, where there's a lot of terminology where it says periodic or occasionally or something along that lines. Now they've tied that all back to a risk assessment that you basically, from an organization standpoint, you can do whatever with periodic, but you have to point that back to some type of risk analysis of what's appropriate for your organization. So classic example, if you have swipe terminals, one of the things that you're supposed to do periodically is look to see if there's any tampering or substitution to the device in requirement 9.9. And that's periodically. So it's basically up to the organization. Now they're saying, where's your analysis to say what that time frame is? So is it every week? Is it once a month? Is it once a year? Type of thing. You need to basically look at the factors involved with that and come to a determination from an organization.
Great. And then, probably a classic example is the, antivirus versus endpoint detection and response from a standpoint of
Yep.
the control. So EDR covers, if you will, antivirus.
Yes. Yeah. In fact, they specifically added in requirement 5, they added the verbiage to say it either needs to do a scan once a week or be an active behavioral based component, which is where EDR comes into play. So they added specific verbiage to actually cover EDR solutions.
Okay, great. What about ATM cash outs?
Okay.
Not sure if, I know that's not all just PCI, but would things, and I know we've touched on this in other webinars, would file integrity monitoring be able to detect that? That was something you said that, you might not need to do anymore, or there might be better alternatives.
Yep.
I guess maybe on just what are ATM cash outs, if you could, and then, kind of talk about the file integrity monitoring.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Haven't dealt with this largely since the Diebold days of my career and everything. But essentially, ATM cash outs, it could be a variety of mechanisms, but largely if you compromise the OS of the ATM, you could alter the logic to spit out cash, essentially. There are other potentially mechanical interceptions with that you could also try to do that as well. Those are obviously more complex, but a lot of times you mentioned FIM with that. FIM is, in my personal opinion, kind of an outdated tool. A lot of people don't do FIM good. So, and if anybody's, needs a little clarification, file integrity monitoring essentially looks at your operating system for critical files, executional files, DLL files, whatever, kind of core components that if it changed, it, better be by an authorized person with that perspective there. The problem is, it creates a lot of noise. And first off, if you don't tune it correctly, you're just going to get a whole bunch of files always changing. Secondly, a lot of those changes, if you're pushing out patches and everything like that, could actually be valid noise type of thing. So what often happens if you're monitoring for, files changing onto the OSs, you're getting all these changes all over the place, and it's hard to actually filter out what's approved changes versus, that one file that's not approved, type of thing. So what would be better, especially on a closed environment like an ATM, application whitelisting, where you're actually authorizing only the allowed applications onto that device, and any other one gets shut down immediately, or even some type of behavioral, EDR solution, actually looking at what the applications are doing and monitoring for that is far more effective than looking at what's changed and then hoping that somebody catches it upstream in enough time to actually do anything about it, type of thing. So,
Okay, great. Segmentation comes up. Has segmentation mostly been done already for PCI environments? And if not, what are still some of the challenges? And then are there any better practices for it, going forward? And maybe that, this has to do with the evolving environments that organizations are dealing with.
yeah, so I mean, the segmentation, if you look at the top of the data security standard, the DSS, and there's even a guidance paper on scoping and segmentation that from a QSA standpoint, we point to a lot to get kind of feedback from that on appropriateness from the PCI Council and everything. But quite honestly, the base for good segmentation is that that you're filtering traffic inbound and outbound based on what's business justified for the organization. There's some other components on obviously, using secure protocols and things of that nature for authentication, transmission of cardholder data, a whole bunch of other aspects go into that. But essentially bringing it down to that, there's a lot of gray area when it comes from a QSA standpoint. I've seen implementations, even though the verbiage is out there, a lot of QSAs kind of look at it and they might not be well versed on certain segmentation, or 802.1x comes up and they're just not clear on how that impacts PCI scoping. Or what's really big, and we actually field a number of questions to this, is that once you get into a cloud environment and you have a intermixture of serverless containers and maybe full-fledged VMs like EC2 instance on AWS, all of a sudden segmentation becomes its own kind of animal, into that, and understanding first, what segmentation means in between the different services and, components that you're putting into that. But second, where does that fall from the cloud provider versus your responsibility, type of thing. So there's definitely a lot of the times that when we go into it, especially a new PCI customer, with that, we'll go through and actually help them kind of map out, first off, we'll start with, okay, where is cardholder data? Walk me through the flows. Where is it encrypted during transmission? Where's the termination points? What systems are touching it? What systems are storing it? Everything like that. And then we'll kind of walk backwards from there, so once we identify the, the components that are actually touching cardholder data, then we look at, okay, where does it sit within the network? Where's the segmentation points? Pull those ACLs down. Let's look at it, and start kind of walking it backwards. And then at that point, you should have a pretty good understanding of where cardholder data is within your organization. Then you can make, basically look at PCI and apply it on top of that good scope. But that's one of the things with our approach. When we start an engagement, we basically ask 3 artifacts from a customer. We ask for your network diagram, your cardholder data flow diagram, and requirement 2.4 requires that you have an inventory of all your PCI assets. Those 3 things there help us kind of set the base of, what we're looking at. And then we look at basically the control application on top of that.
Okay, great. And you touched on this a little bit, but question coming on cloud. What have been the bigger changes with technology that's affected security and PCI compliance you've seen? So I guess that would be like containers and things like that.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different things that, especially the way PCI is written now, a lot of it wasn't based on cloud. There is a guidance document out there for cloud infrastructure, but it's mainly geared to how to determine who has what responsibility. So, the infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service, and determining who has what in what role, type of thing.
Yeah.
But we field a lot of different questions when it comes down to, hey, I'm using, CI/CD to do quick delivery with that. But, in this, it says I have to, test for security. How do I integrate that so that we're not slowing down our pipeline release to actually get out to the cloud fast? Because we want to be really agile and we want to push out features, on a weekly, bi-weekly basis, whatever that may be. Type of thing. So we field a lot of different questions on, what tooling is out there that we're aware of, integrating some open source with some commercial tooling into the pipeline, where to put it in the pipeline, have different roles within, within the release process that, people can troubleshoot with that, different training, to how to use the tools, incorporating it into your IDE, so developers can take use of it while they're coding, type of thing, so it doesn't clog up, the release cycle, ideally. So yeah, so there's a lot of different questions. We'll go into that. And then, as you mentioned, now we have a variety of ways that you can actually deploy into the cloud and even sometimes into a multi-cloud environment, type of thing. So looking at that as, infrastructure as code, where, your actual deployment for systems is all configured into one big configuration file. And how do you incorporate that into, baselining and, comparing that back to some sort of base, which PCI requires. So whether that be CIS or, some other flavor of OS, that you're deploying out there. So we could do a whole talk on that type of thing. But yeah, it's and that's one of the things, and shameless plug, from a TrustedSec perspective, we really sit down and look at your environment and give you kind of pointed recommendations. We're not just here as like QSAs that never want to talk to. Most of our customers we talk to all throughout the year, and it's with questions regarding this, type of thing. In fact, in the last week, I think I've had 3 calls with different customers that we don't have an active engagement with, but they're talking to us about, hey, I'm thinking about doing this. What's your opinion? How will this affect PCI? Do you have any other recommendations? Help me understand how this is applicable to my environment, type of thing. So
building on that, how outside of us, of course, how should
Yeah.
someone go about selecting a good QSA?
Yeah.
Doesn't it make sense to go with a less experienced one so they don't know as much, or what? What do you really see in that, or what are some of the stories? I guess just adding on to that. What are some of the stories you've heard of bad QSAs?
Oh, stories.
Yeah.
So, our philosophy at TrustedSec, and personally my philosophy when I ran security organizations, is I wanted a fair partner that would come in and give me a good assessment, but not be a pain in the butt, type of thing, and would go outside the bounds of what I actually had to. That doesn't mean I don't welcome recommendations and solutions, to that, but I don't want them saying, hey, you need right now with the standard, you need AV on your Linux systems or something like that, which was a question that I got into running a security program with another QSA company, type of thing. And, pointing back to say, it says commonly affected. Do you consider Linux systems commonly? And they shot back to me. He's like, no, they can be. I was like, okay, but that's not the verbiage of, the control and everything, and it's a little bit different on how, and that's how the philosophy we bring here at TrustedSec is we want to be that good partner. We want to help you kind of raise the bar. We'll commonly say, and a number of people say in the industry that, that compliance isn't security, which is absolutely true. But we want to help you understand where the line is, and ideally maybe what you want to shoot for, but we're measuring to this, today. So it's up to your determination, your budget, your resources, your priorities, into that. And however we can help, we're glad to help with that. But at the end of the day, here's the bar we're measuring to, type of thing. And looking at it from that perspective. So first off, with that philosophy in mind, if you're looking at new QSAs, I would definitely interview them, from a, who's on your team, what kind of resources do you have? And I've just put this out as kind of a fair warning. A lot of times when you're talking to a new QSA company, they'll put the best QSA out in front. Ask about some of the other people as well, with that. So I've seen the bait and switch move, quite often where, they have somebody that's been in the industry 20 years, knows back and forth PCI off the top of their hand. And then when you sign up, you get kid that just got their QSA, 2 weeks ago, and they're doing your assessment. And the biggest problem with that type of thing is that the interpretation, when you get into complex situations, they may give you wrong advice. And then if it gets caught later, all of a sudden you're in a remediation phase going beyond your due date, which, it's a situation you want to avoid at all costs, type of thing. So, make sure that they have, ask them how they have a unified approach across the team, how they kind of maintain one standard, because there are gray areas within PCI that there are determinations that are coming out of different QSA companies. If you have any unique situations in your organization that you're doing a ROC with, I would definitely run it by them and see what their kind of gut reaction is, type of thing. So if it's, hey, we're sending cardholder data like this way, we've been in compliance doing this segmentation, do you think this is, a right approach? And would you still hold that as being good? And ask them, their opinion with that. Lastly, I would say, see what their model is. I already mentioned, with TrustedSec and how we, help our clients out with that. That's a big thing, especially, with 4.0 being released a little bit later this year. There's going to be a ton of help that's going to be needed from a whole bunch of different merchants and service providers. We're going to be putting together a package to basically do a transition from 3.2.1 to 4.0. Later this year, to actually help different individuals to, upgrade with that. If we're doing a review with that, but we might even release some stuff, and we're doing webinars and blogs and things of that nature. But that's one of the things that we're here to kind of help you along with that, and, get that kind of implemented and make sure it's a smooth transition as much as possible. So.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, back to cloud. What are best practices for data migrations? And one thing that you said that I just wanted to ask about was, when does it make sense, or why would an organization have a multi-cloud environment Wouldn't that make it much more challenging, or is there some specific reason they're doing that?
Yeah, so I'll answer the latter first.
First,
um, so a lot of times once you're getting into multi-cloud, they basically want to minimize the risk of a single provider. And, we've seen, it's a rare occasion, but there have been AWS outages, because of user error and things of that nature. And quite honestly, if you're running some type of container, whether it be Kubernetes or Docker or something like that, each of those services you can kind of critique and deploy into those environments and everything. So that's the main reason with that. If you're doing the same service. Now, there are some customers that they look at different advantages, whether they're doing like machine learning or, doing Kubernetes, which, I think Google does a little bit better. Those type of aspects, there might be slight advantages in one cloud provider versus another. And that's up to the customer with that. I think it has to be a weight decision, because if for you to enter a whole new environment, there's a management component that adds on to that. So all of a sudden, you're probably going to need tooling that crosses that, instead of using some of the native tooling that's unique to the cloud provider for security and monitoring and stuff of that nature. So, but those are all different considerations for different users and everything like that. On to data migration. So if you're talking about like coming from an on-prem solution, like you're hosting in your local colo or something like that, and you're saying, hey, cloud's a new thing, I want to migrate out to that, or whatever it may be. I mean, it takes a little bit. A lot of users, depending on how you're architected, could potentially go pretty fast. I mean, if you just spin up some VMs and kind of copy that, depending on what your base is, you could go up into the cloud environment pretty quickly, because they're just systems up there, running an application. Obviously, I'm oversimplifying it. There's a lot of complexity depending on how the application's architected, what the database backend is, things of that nature, and working through caching is always terrible, but load balancing and stuff of that nature. But a lot of those tools are right in front of you within the cloud provider. And there's also marketplaces that if the native solution doesn't work, there's other providers out there that could potentially augment and do other components into that as well. So, but that's just kind of a lift and shift. What a number of people also look at is whether they can optimize their deployments, so whether they're going from, just maintaining VMs, which, is a lot of work for patching and, configuration management and all that stuff and monitoring, to doing some type of container model, or ideally, if their code base is suited to it, deploying into a serverless type environment with, either Lambda functions or App Engine for Google or whatever it may be. So, and that would require potentially more dev work to actually get that there. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers the question. There's a lot of complexity in it, and it really depends on how your application is architected and stuff of that nature. So.
Okay, great. It's been mentioned about when building applications, there's a stricter standard for controlling access. Could you expand on that?
Stricter standard controlling access to applications?
I would think so. Let's say.
Okay.
But yeah.
So, I mean, as far as PCI is concerned, a lot of the dev work right now in like 3.2.1 is pretty basic, type of thing. They have it that you need to separate, prod and QA test, environments. Don't use production code into your development environment. Make sure that there's approvals before pushing code into it. Make sure there's testing. Make sure there's peer review. So a lot of that stuff is kind of into there. When you're talking about, actually with the access, and with the identification authorization, either within apps or in OS, basically requirement 7 is the big component with that. And it essentially just says you need least privilege, all the way through. So does the person need access? Yes or no, type of thing, and deploying that. I mean, it gives a lot of flexibility to the customer. It gives a lot of flexibility to the QSAs. And I think that's intentional from the PCI council that, they're not out there to say yes or no from an authorization. They're basically saying if they need access, the business needs to justify why they need access. And the QSA needs to validate that. So if your janitor has access to deploy into production, there might be questions that's being raised up or something like that. So
Gotcha. And then I guess building on that one, can you discuss the software security framework, the replacement of the
yep.
PADSS?
Yeah. Yeah. So they're actually doing a good move. And I actually like the fundamentals of it. So one of the things that I really like, so a lot of the stuff, the PADSS, which was the old Visa standard, the PABP, I think it was, if my acronyms are and memory is correct with that. But essentially, there's been some updates to that, but this is, a major update, and it's been in works for a couple of years and everything. But essentially, what they're doing, one of the biggest improvements that I like is that they're modularizing the actual framework. So if all you're doing is key injection from a component perspective, you can just get certified for that type of thing. Or if you're doing, payment gateway or software deployment or things of that nature, each one of these are separate components that you can actually get certified to. The nice thing about that is it's pretty flexible. So with a lot of these solutions, so now when we're looking at for doing encryption, point-to-point encryption, a lot of those solutions are based on, first off, it has to be a PIN transaction security certified device that integrates with a holistic solution for doing P2P with that. And each of those different vendors and players kind of play different parts depending on what the solution is. Now they can get certified into these parts and then fit into other holistic solutions. They don't have to get certified to the whole thing. They can do component by component depending on the services that they want to fill into that. So that's the biggest thing. There's also a number of different improvements that they're doing from switching kind of their methodology and where it kind of fits within the software life cycle and stuff of that nature. So
Okay, great. There's a good one. What are the biggest concerns, changes in mobile? And I know we talked about this, some before, and with the pandemic and all, I guess it's moving.
yep.
But what are the concerns that you're seeing, or have they increased, or where's PCI with it?
Yeah, so I think if we're talking about like work from home, from a perspective there, so we fielded a lot of questions, especially last year, onto that because from the pandemic and the quick reactions to now everybody's working from home, obviously has introduced a little bit of components, where potentially people are using their own devices to process transactions, or now they're at home, so technically from a PCI standpoint, that's considered a sensitive area. So, and is that in scope from a ROC? Do we go visit people's homes to confirm whether they have locks on the doors and everything like that? So there's been a number of questions and we had to work through, and some of it we point back to verbiage that we can rely on. Some of it we kind of made our own kind of TrustedSec, again, go into that gray area with QSAs to say, here's our stance on if somebody's taking transactions from home, like they're doing customer service or something like that. Here are the things that they need to be able to do it in a secure environment to make sure that there's no unauthorized individuals there, and et cetera, and kind of advise a number of clients along that lines. For the most part, as long as you're controlling all the assets, the physical part can be done through policies and training and things of that nature, with some minor validation of like that they do have an environment that they can work securely from. So if you're living with other people in the household, don't take calls over at your kitchen table or something like that. Make sure that you can isolate yourself while being taking calls from an employee perspective. But from a technology perspective, a lot of that can be accomplished as long as it's employer-owned devices that you can control and monitor those type of devices. We've had the conversation that you could potentially do it BYOB, but then all your employees basically turn into a service provider, and you would essentially have to mandate that they do their own security at home and get them to test and prove each year. And that's largely not feasible, from an organization standpoint, type of thing. But essentially that's kind of the approach, from that perspective there. And so far, at least for a lot of the customers that I've worked with, I haven't heard of anything kind of bubbling back that there's really been any issues. And even if there were to be issues with, a single employee, hopefully it would be minimal because they're only handling one card at a time, type of thing. So.
Anything then with the mobile applications, is that just back to the regular application development, or are there any other concerns with that?
Yeah, so there is a guidance document out there, but largely, I'll sum it up. It's if it's an employee-owned or a consumer-owned device, you're not responsible for it, type of thing. So in that perspective, it comes down to software management. So how are you treating the card data on the phone itself? Hopefully you're not storing it on the phone, things of that nature that, just kind of come into play with that perspective there. But yeah, it's really requirement 6 for the software development perspective. And that's it. It's a little bit different if, say, for example, you're an employer and you're given tablets out, to, process transactions either out in the field or a little bit mobile away from a register or something like that. Generally, we recommend that you put, some type of mobile, controlling software on it, like Intune or something the like, that you can control some of the policies with it. But again, it comes down to basically making sure they're patched, they're encrypted, and the like type of thing. So.
Okay, great. What are the challenges with end-to-end encryption? Most are doing it, but where are companies failing?
Yep. Yeah. So, and this will be, as we mentioned before, a requirement moving forward. Most people, I would say about 95%, when you're transmitting cardholder data, they're most likely doing it. I think most people within the past, 5 to 7 years, maybe even beyond that, encryption is now mainly a default, at least in most of the conversations. So you wouldn't even think about doing a, administrative tunnel, over telnet anymore. That's kind of a, a quash right there, type of thing. But, it's a little bit different when you're dealing with maybe just a transmission of data. And it's going to be a requirement. Most people are doing transmission of it. Some of the things that we see kind of keep coming up. One of the things PCI actually considers as a transmission of cardholder data is if you're taking calls over a voice over IP solution. With that, there's an FAQ out on the PCI Council's website that says, yep, we consider this a transmission of cardholder data. And most customers, if they haven't considered the implementation to it, has left basically VoIP unencrypted, going over internal networks and everything, which again opens up scoping to say, okay, now we're transmitting cardholder data across our general network with this. So that's one thing that I think we'll see once it's required. And a lot of times when we're going in to actually do an assessment or audit with this, when we walk through and say VoIP is in scope and here's the segmentation impact to not encrypting, a lot of customers are then motivated to say, okay, let's flip on, encryption over VoIP transmission with that and everything. Another thing we'll see, commonly-ish is that a lot of transmission will be terminated at a load balancer and then sent to the web server, unencrypted and everything,
Mm-hmm.
which a lot of the times are on the same network or same kind of plane. So it doesn't really add a lot of segmentation, impact into that. But now with 4.0 coming out, there might be, some impact where you now have to re-encrypt and then decrypt onto the web server with that, which, is just a little more complication on certificate management with that. From that perspective there. And lastly, on from the mainframe folks out there, most of the big, especially in the fintech arena, they've deployed some type of quote unquote secure telnet type of thing. They'll connect, to the terminal via an encrypted browser or kind of, or terminal based application, but it is encrypted. But that kind of in between mainframe secure telnet may be unencrypted. So again, another potential with that. But I would say on the whole, especially in point of sale devices, you would be hard pressed to find anything that's unencrypted now going across the network and everything. So.
Great. Looks like the last one so far. What are account testing attacks? Have you heard of these?
Account testing attacks. What do you mean by
that? Also referred as payment account enumeration or card testing and bin attacks.
Okay. Yeah. So if I'm kind of inferring from the question and everything, for most cards, PCI does not consider a card if it's masked out from the first 6 and last 4. So that kind of, if you're talking about a 16 digit card, it's that middle 6 with it, which is even significantly less if you're doing a mod 10 or LUN, check with that. It's only a tenth of the, the numbers with it. So potentially, and depending on your processor, but the only thing required to actually process a card number is actually the expiration date. Now you can have AVS or address verification, on with that, and you can also check, some other components like name. You get potentially more, false negatives, into that, implementing some of those things. So, but the only thing required is the PAN and, expiration date if you're doing a card not present with that. Not even a CVV is required to process. But again, that's another added check that you can do to validate the card and everything. So in that perspective, if you know, the bin or bins with that, the last 4, you could potentially brute force if there's no potential checks onto that to get a valid card, on there. And the expiration date is basically, potentially 36 guesses, 3 years out on most cards, on top of that. So if that's what they're referring to, then it happens, but there's a lot of checks. Most processors will have threshold attacks. They'll look at, validations with it. What this largely will see is that a lot of gift card attacks, especially ones that are hanging up on the racks, they'll do like, they'll actually pre-get like the gift card, and a lot of these are closed, but some of them are open as well. And a definition of closed is basically off the card brand networks. Open is like Visa, MasterCard, Discover, whatever it is, from a card perspective. But either which way, there's sites that you can actually check your balance, and a lot of people look at that, and look at card numbers and check, they'll take the card, scratch it off, see the number, and then kind of repaint over it, and then wait for somebody to actually fill that card with an amount, and they'll keep like checking it once a day or something like that. But most people, a lot of people outsource it to 2 big companies called Blackhawk or Incom from management, and they have checks to say, okay, is this card being checked before it was loaded? Is there any type of checks, being done, with that? And if there is, they basically lock the card up, so that it won't be able to be drained. In fact, when they go to load it, there'll be an error, with that type of thing. So,
okay, last one, because we only have a couple minutes. Where do most organizations fail or struggle with? I guess particularly over the last year, I'd be interested in.
Particularly last year. So just in general, I'll kind of cover first. It depends on it depends on your attitude with security, type of thing. So depending on the organization, if you come out in there with a kind of laissez-faire, like I have to do security to get PCI off my back and everything like that, it's often a constant struggle, to get either ownership over stuff or responsibility over different things. And oftentimes we'll see reoccurrence of issues year over year on certain aspects, and having to have the conversations like, hey, this was a problem last year, it's now a problem this year, type of thing. And really the biggest thing that I would recommend that those companies can do is just look for somebody to own security and promote them as high as you can into the organization, type of thing. And oftentimes it's a lot of people look at it as security's everybody's responsibility, which it is, type of thing, but it also has to be responsible for some people in the organization, not just everybody. Because when it's everybody's responsibility, it's nobody's responsibility, type of thing. So oftentimes we'll see nobody kind of really dedicated to security, or if they're 5 layers deep in IT and really have no power to do anything into that regard there. So that would be kind of my main recommendation from a this year, and everything has kind of happened, and kind of our relook at how people go to work and where they're actually coming from. I think there'll be a big kind of de-emphasis on on-prem solutions, and their first thing will be looking toward the cloud. And what that means, especially for small to mid-sized organizations, is they really need to get a good handle on how they, do some type of centralized identification and authorization with that. So no longer can we just go up to a web portal and sign everybody up, type of thing, especially when we have 100 of those. And when somebody quits or, change roles and they no longer need access, their account just remains, in infamy, type of thing. So really looking at that, how you kind of centralize those controls across all the different kind of platforms, making sure that, nobody wants to patch a system. So, doing a kind of cloud first, and that doesn't mean the big cloud providers, but it could mean a SaaS solution. Is this our main focus, or should we build it internally? And most of the time it's not our main focus, and you should look for another tooling out there, type of thing. And then looking at, security partners out there to kind of augment your staff, kind of if you can't afford a full-time security, look for people to kind of help you into that, that perspective there. Those are kind of general ones. I mean, patch management is always a problem, with that. There's always, question with that. I remember talking with a customer a couple of years back that, they do patch management like once a quarter, and they have to manually patch like 500 systems, like literally log into each system to patch it. And it was like, why are you doing that? Like, you can centralize that. So, type of thing. So yeah, I mean, just there's a ton of components that you can automate out there and get better monitoring and visibility into your infrastructure, or outsource it, to somebody else that, like an AWS or Google or Azure, that have way more security engineers, that are looking after, some of the components there. So I think that's typically, and there's risks obviously on a lot of that side. So I don't want to oversimplify, but there's a definite reward for organizations that don't have a dedicated team or a budget to do a lot of that stuff. So look for partners that you can augment those services. So.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I know the hour flew by. We rapid fired question at you, so really appreciate you being able to take those and get through them. So really appreciate your time, and thank you everyone for joining. We look forward to seeing you next time. And again, this will be posted, and we'll have other blogs and such on the topics coming forward. So thank you again. Really appreciate the time. Have a great day.
See you, everyone.